Okay, so in our first introductory lecture on arguments, I gave a slightly more comprehensive discussion about what arguments are, how arguments work, why people have continued to use them, why people study them, and so on. So in this lecture, we want to turn our attention just to Rachel's discussion, his basic points about arguments and their relevance to ethics. And I'll focus the lecture primarily around this quotation from his piece. Namely, he says, philosophy without argument would be a lifeless exercise. And so one of the important things we want to get out of this chapter is understanding what Rachel means by that. Why is it that he thinks that philosophy, and in particular in our case, ethics without argument, is going to be a lifeless exercise? So you might want to stop the video for a minute, think about that for yourself. Why is argument so integral to philosophy and ethics? And then you can start the video again, and you can see how I structure the discussion about this quotation. So I'm going to emphasize this idea that Rachel has of giving reasons and in contrast of having reasons. So Rachel is going to want to talk about arguments because arguments are the primary vehicles by which we give reasons, develop reasons, and evaluate reasons for our ethical judgments, our ethical beliefs, our ethical principles, and our ethical actions. Okay? So giving reasons and having reasons turns out to serve an incredibly useful function. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. We're going to go back and revisit that notion of an inferential claim. Remember that in the last lecture we talked about arguments as collections of statements that are structured in such a way that they start with a set of statements that express evidence, premises, assumptions, common agreed upon facts. They then have a statement that expresses a conclusion, something that is said to be made more likely to be true or guaranteed to be true by the truth of the premise, and then they have that inferential claim built into them, that the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion in the case of a deductive argument, or that the truth of the premises makes the conclusion highly probable in the case of an inductive argument. So there's a set of premises, statements that express basic evidence, basic assumptions. There's a conclusion, a statement that expresses a belief that you haven't so far committed to or that you don't necessarily hold, and then a claim about the relationship between the truth of that evidence and the truth or the likely truth of the conclusion. And so we'll look at that again. And by looking at inferential claims and how they work in arguments, we'll then focus on two different ways that you can evaluate or criticize an argument. You can look at the argument's content. Are the premises, the evidence, in fact, true? And you can look at the logical form, the underlying structure of the argument. Does the argument, in fact, make a correct or accurate or successful claim about the truth of the premises and the conclusion? Then we'll turn to the specific example that Rachel uses in this chapter to illustrate this point. So he talks about a particular view that he calls moral skepticism. And we'll talk about what moral skepticism is, and then we'll look at two arguments that Rachel introduces and then criticizes that purport to give us reasons for accepting this view of moral skepticism. So the first argument we'll look at he calls the cultural differences argument. So we'll talk about the argument, what the premises are, what the conclusion is, what the nature of the inferential claim is. Then we'll look at his criticism of that argument. And in criticizing this argument, what Rachel's does is he questions whether or not the inferential claim is in fact a good inferential claim, whether the argument is in fact logically good. And so he wants to argue against the argument by arguing that it is in fact invalid, that the truth of the premises do not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Now, in doing so, he isn't arguing that moral skepticism is false. What he is arguing is that the truth of the premises in this particular argument will not give us good reasons to accept moral skepticism as true. So they don't give us reasons to accept the conclusion. It's not a good model for an inference because the truth of the premises will not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. The argument is logically deficient. Then we'll look at the second argument that Rachel introduces and ultimately criticizes that purports to support this view of moral skepticism, the provability argument. And in this case, right, what we'll see is that Rachel criticizes this argument using our other strategy. He'll question whether or not the premises are in fact true. And so he'll want to argue that this argument is unsound. It may or may not have good logical form. Right? It may or may not be the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. But what it is missing is the other component of a good argument. That is, at least one of its premises aren't true. And if the premises aren't true, then the inferential claim that the truth of the premises will guarantee the truth of the conclusion doesn't actually get us anywhere. It doesn't make the conclusion more likely to be true because the premises, one or more, aren't true. And so when an argument is deficient in content, whether or not it's deficient in its logical form, it is considered to be unsound. And so Rachel will argue that the provability argument is an unsound argument for moral skepticism. So when thinking about this quote, right, philosophy without argument would be a lifeless exercise. What Rachel is trying to do here is to illustrate how argument works in ethical and other debate, how it provides us with a vehicle for constructive interaction with people. And in doing so, he then wants to illustrate how arguments function in a specific case. So he talks about it generally, and he gives us a specific illustration. And for Rachel's, arguments provide us with a structured, disciplined way of giving reasons and of having reasons. So when we think about ethical beliefs, ethical choices, ethical principles, right, one of the things that we'll notice is that people's beliefs, their choices, their principles, their ethical judgments, they don't always agree with one another. Different cultures, different individuals may have conflicting views about the rightness or wrongness of a particular action, about the generality of a particular ethical principle. And because there is this conflict, right, we need a vehicle by which to mediate that conflict when we interact with each other. And this is particularly important in issues like ethics, because ethical properties aren't the sort of properties that we have sort of direct empirical tests for. So if I want to decide whether or not a liquid is acidic or base, I can stick a piece of litmus paper in, and depending on the color that the paper turns, I will get an answer, a fact that I can visualize. I can see this is an acidic liquid. This is a base liquid. If I want to know what the temperature of my, say, morning coffee is, I can stick a thermometer in that coffee, and that will allow me to measure, right, to operationalize, to get a specific fact about the nature of the world and the properties of particular objects. In ethics, we seem sometimes naively to think that we have that ability. So we may have a strong emotional reaction. Right? So if you see someone, say, torturing animals for their own amusement, you might have a very strong negative emotional reaction to that. Right? Lots of people will, not everyone, I would note. But there's nothing about your seeing that action that provides you with an intersubjectively reliable way of determining that that's in fact the property of that action, that it is in fact morally abhorrent. So how do we go about figuring out what the properties of actions or choices or principles are in the ethical realm if we don't just have a mechanical way of testing for their presence or absence in particular cases. And so we find Rachel at the end of this chapter talking about how we have to be careful to temper our emotional responses to situations by reasons. We have to be able to justify our judgments, not just feel them. Now, similarly, lots of people will have intuitions about something being ethically right or ethically wrong. Right? So you'll see somebody picking on, some poor, helpless school kid, and you'll have an intuition. Well, that's a bad person. Right? And those intuitions may be correct, they may be incorrect, but people will differ in their intuitions. And we'll see when we look at what is morality that in complex, difficult, out of the ordinary cases, oftentimes people's intuitions are conflicting in nature. They don't provide us with a operation that allows us to determine the actual property of some event in a way that everyone can use that technique to agree upon the answer. And so because we don't just have tags on actions and choices and beliefs that tell us they're good or they're bad ethically, we have to come up with ways of determining the presence or absence of ethical praiseworthiness or the presence or absence of ethical blameworthiness in actions, choices, and beliefs based upon giving reasons. And so by presenting arguments for our ethical beliefs or ethical choices or principles, we have this vehicle for engaging with people that we may disagree with that allows us to constructively interact with them, to get some basis for converging on agreement or coming to the truth of the matter. And so giving reasons, in particular, presenting arguments for your view, is crucial in domains where there's just no obvious way to measure the ethical properties, for instance, of a particular action. Giving reasons also is useful in interacting with people because it allows us to defend our beliefs or our choices or actions, and even to persuade people who may disagree with us. And so our ability to articulate our reasons allows us to defend ourselves against criticism, allows us to understand the reasons why we do things and why other people do the things that they do. It allows us a means to persuade them without just brute force, and so on. So giving reasons provides this crucial function as well. And finally, as we saw when we talked about arguments in the first lecture, arguments provide this way of giving us a permanent objective record of an argument, a model for an inference, so that we can evaluate that argument. We can determine whether or not that is a good inference. We can look at the premises and see if they really are true or they really are things that we agree with. We can look at the inferential claim and see if the inferential claim really is successful. If it's a deductive argument, if the premises are true, is it really the case that the conclusion has to be true? Or is it possible for the premises to be true without guaranteeing the conclusion being true? And so we're able to evaluate our ethical views and decide whether or not particular arguments give us good reasons for adopting a particular belief or course of action. Having reasons is also really